Yeah. Welcome back. We haven't been together for a few weeks. We have other stuff to do. Very important Christian holidays to celebrate. Yes. And we're leaving Jesus alone now to clear into another savior from Rotterdam. I'm very happy to have Jeroen van der Waal here. He's a professor at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And even though we work in, well, it's still social science, sociology, right? But it's also somewhat of a different field. But it's always nice in this sort of politics lab journey that we're on now for a few years to wander the world and find kindred spirits, people who like to think about as outside the box like we do, but then outside the box we find each other. And that's something I've really appreciated in following your work in the last few years. And so on Twitter, I said, please join us this Friday because this is going to be crazy. And since you don't have Twitter, I just wanted to say that. And so I'm really looking forward to, you can already see the title, but apparently Jeroen is going to present something with IATs and cultural capital. That sounds really crazy to me. So I can't wait to hear more. And for those of you new here today, also warm welcome. Jeroen will talk for 20 minutes, 25, and then we'll do Q&A. There are also people online. Questions. Okay.
Thank you very much, guys, and thank you for inviting me. Good to be here. So yeah, measuring non-declarative cultural capital and exploring its social situatedness, which I wrote with various colleagues, which I will introduce later on. But first, setting the stage. I think as social scientists, you're all very aware of the pattern that the socioeconomic position of parents is highly consequential for the socioeconomic position of children, as in social economic inequalities reproduce intergenerationally. And one main path how this occurs is via the educational system. So more educated parents in various ways succeed much better in letting their own children attain also higher levels of education. This is a pattern found across the globe. And as I'm a sociologist of stratification, and this idea of intergenerational social reproduction in sociologist terms is what is often considered the bedrock of that specific field. So that is what we study. And this can occur in various ways. And today there's one theoretical line of argument from Bourdieu, which focuses on the role of cultural capital and so-called cultural reproduction, which I will introduce to you shortly. But the main goal of the study that I'm now presenting is not so much contributing in a theoretical sense, but in a methodological sense. So what I will present to you is a methodological innovation. So please bear with me. But before I can introduce that innovation to you, first some ideas on the background, the theoretical background of why, according to these authors, me and my fellow authors, this methodological innovation is needed. So Bourdieu, French sociologist, and the notion of cultural capital and cultural reproduction have been developed by him, especially in the 1960s and 70s in France. Now, I do not read French, so fortunately, for social scientists like me, there was an English translation of La Distinction in 1984. And the basic ideas that guide this research can be found in these two studies, also Reproduction, Education, Society and Culture, together with Jean-Claude Passeron, which was published somewhat earlier. And so what is cultural capital about? Cultural capital is affinity with elite culture. So that you understand and also master elite culture. And others would label it something like high-class status signals which are used for social and cultural exclusion. Now, that's still rather abstract, I understand this. But the whole idea is that if you are born and raised in the upper strata, so if you have parents of higher socioeconomic background, literally from day one, day you are born, you are socialized in a taste pattern, so what you like, what you dislike, but also in behavioral and communication patterns, so how you speak with people, or what you laugh about, what you actually do not laugh about, and so on and so forth. This is ingrained from day one because you're socialized in the higher strata. Now, that is what cultural capital is all about. So it's not so much one specific aspect. Let's say the type of music that we like in an opera has high status overtones, and let's say rap and metal has low status overtones. No, but it's about all that you can imagine in the cultural sense. So music, what you listen to, what you like to look at. But when it comes to all types of behaviors, how we communicate, your posture, the type of clothing, especially how you wear it, and so on and so forth. So that's a lot, but generally, this is what is often referred to as affinity with elite culture. Not only having affinity with it, but also mastering it. And the notion of cultural reproduction is as follows. The basic claim is when you have ample cultural capital, you succeed much better in navigating educational institutions. And that is because educational institutions have a strong fit with your own background and culture. In other words, high cultural capital is what is especially appreciated in educational settings. And it's not merely, and this is a very important distinction that I'm going to make now, which is often referred to now as declarative and non-declarative. It has a declarative part, so what we consciously, a taste that we consciously arrive at. Let's say I would have a conversation with you why I like a specific author or a specific musician, and so on. But there's also a non-declarative part, and that is, it is ingrained, hardwired, more type of a disposition, which is often without intention, without conscious control, performed and demonstrated. And that is especially we know that in practically all countries, you see that children of more educated parents fare much better in educational institutions. And according to the Bourdieusian analysis, that is because they demonstrate more cultural capital in those institutions, not only consciously, but also unconsciously. And therefore, in the end, children from more educated parents much more often also succeed in attaining higher levels of education. That's a theoretical line of argument. Now, this inspired quite some empirical research, which I'll show you on the next slide, but it has two caveats. One, what you see in those so-called cultural reproduction studies is that they measure this by means of survey items in a very, very specific way. Appreciation of highbrow culture, how often you go to the opera, how often you go to museums, and so on and so forth. Now, without doubt, this is part of cultural capital. But cultural capital entails much, much more. Right? So that's one. The second one, and here's where the methodological innovation lies, is that if you ask people what they do and what they like in surveys, that is what is referred to here as declarative cultural capital. So you consciously arrive at answering a survey question. Well, the non-declarative part, according to Bourdieusian theorizing, is so crucial in understanding this reproduction of inequality. But how then to include this in empirical studies? So that is what the methodological innovation is about. Now, here to give you an idea, this is an overview of 2016 by Jaeger and an associate. And what you see here at the upper left corner, that's not so much surprising that if you ask people by means of survey questions, whether they go to the opera, whether they go to museums and so on, that this is quite strongly intergenerationally reproduced. So in other words, children from parents who often perform these type of cultural consumption, also more often perform this type of cultural consumption. So that's nothing shocking, I would say, as everybody would expect. And then outcome academic achievement, and later outcome educational attainment. And then you see from the early 1980s onwards, time and again, it is found children from parents who report high levels of cultural capital by means of these survey items fare much better in educational institutions, better grades, they attain higher levels, and so on and so forth. Each time, again and again, this is found, and when we go through time, it becomes more methodologically advanced. So you have now the idea of theory of cultural capital and cultural reproduction, but empirically, this is merely demonstrated by showing that children of parents who report that they often go, or relatively often go, to museums and to the opera, attain higher levels of education. Now, this is, of course, a rather meager and limited empirical substantiation of the theoretical idea. So a crucial thing to emphasize here is that the authors, and this is the first one who published this kind of cultural reproduction study in American Sociological Review, DiMaggio, in 1982. It's not so much that they deny it, the whole idea that it is largely non-declarative. They each in time emphasize it. Yeah, that's also a crucial part, but simply it is post facto, so after they demonstrate the role of declarative cultural capital in cultural reproduction, then post facto they say, and this must be also because it's partly by means of non-declarative cultural capital. And one additional slide to convince you that it's not merely Curly Boy from Rotterdam and his associates who say this, but it's practically an undebated element of this theoretical line of argument. So it's often said it's unconscious, it's internalized, and it's inculcated. The nature of cultural capital is invoked as a crucial aspect of cultural reproduction on the scrutiny. And so the main challenge is, how can we, in empirical models, also include non-declarative cultural capital, especially because it is considered by all Bourdieusians as the crucial element in cultural reproduction. And this relates to what is often referred to as the cognitive turn in sociology. So here, indeed, sociologists have long recognized that impulse, habit, and other forces beyond the conscious mind shape human thought and behavior. And many sociological arguments, such as the notion of cultural reproduction, implicitly draw on the idea of automatic cognition. So here, time and again, it's emphasized that it must play a role, but theoretical progress or development is simply not met by methodological development or progress. And about that same time, I worked together the first two co-authors of the piece that I'm currently presenting. Julian Schaap on the left, sociologist, also Rotterdam-based, currently working on the role that music can play in mental health. But back then he was finalizing a PhD thesis on the racialization of musical genres. So black rap, white rock, right? And then for that he especially also used implicit association. And we had ongoing conversations together with Willem de Koster, a close associate of mine who also works in Rotterdam, on what you can actually do as a sociologist with those so-called implicit association tests. And in those days, it must be about 16, 17, 18, it became more and more aware, we became more and more aware, this basic Bourdieusian idea of non-declarative cultural capital, that is a thing that, if we understand IH correctly, is something that can be measured by means of implicit association tests. So we published on this as a research note, so simply a line of arguments of how it could be used in 2019 as well, so the same year as the reader on cognitive sociology was published. So then, and this is now 2018, 19, I guess, 2019, we started to develop an implicit association test, or two types actually, as we will see later on, with which to measure non-declarative cultural capital. So Julian Schaap and Willem de Koster are already introduced. Next to Willem is Kjell Noordzij, who's currently working at our department as well. Next week, he will defend his PhD thesis on the political discontent among less educated citizens. Tim van Meurs is currently working at the sociology department here in this building somewhere, but was back then working on a PhD thesis on the low receptivity for health information among less educated citizens, which he will defend in half September. And Joost Oude-Groeniger, also someone who's still currently working with us, but more methodological specialist and most active in public health. So what we then wanted to do, how to develop an implicit association test. And so what you then need to have a list of words that people can categorize swiftly and easily as elite culture or common culture. Volk in Dutch, volks and elite. And if possible, that it covers a wide range of cultural expressions. And so that is what we did. We came up with an initial list of 40 cultural expressions, which according to us were clearly or elitist or common. And these were fielded in a pilot survey in which we asked the people, is this cultural expression, according to you, elitist or common? And so what you then hopefully find is highly skewed distributions, as in that almost everyone says, yeah, this is clearly an elite cultural phenomenon, and this is clearly a common cultural phenomenon. So that works rather well, fortunately. So we came up with 7 elitist and 7 common cultural expressions, which will be presented on the next slide. And these were used to develop 2 types of ayats, one so-called unpleasant or affinity ayat, and one self-concept ayat. They will be discussed later on. So, but the whole idea is that the unpleasant ayat will enables us to measure the ingrained preference for elite culture or common culture, and self-concept is whether people have ingrained it to such an extent that they identify themselves with elite culture or with common culture. It will be elaborated in the next slide. So in English, the concepts of common and elitist these are the items. So gossiping or roddelblad. In English you can read it, in Dutch it's a roddelblad, snackbar, polonaise, shownieuws, I guess, soap, slager and kermis. And then elitist concepts, literatuur, proeverij, opera, culture, I do not know by heart, film festival, classical music and a kunstmuseum. And thus, in the eyes to be presented on the next slide, people the respondents have to very swiftly and without flaws need to be able to categorize these items as being common or elitist by using the E and I dots on the criterion. And the same accounts for the attributes. So for the pleasant, unpleasant, and for the I other, here you see the items that people need to categorize swiftly and without flaw as being pleasant or unpleasant, and related to I or other. And that is depicted here. Yeah. So the practice is the first round. So on the left-hand side, in the practice, words associated with common. And on the right-hand side, you need to categorize words associated with elitist. Now, you see those words pop up on your screen, and then very swiftly, you have to categorize them as being elite or common. Tick, 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 tick. Now, fortunately, this works rather well, which is a first indicator that it is a valid measurement, as in the respondents were almost all very able to very swiftly and without any errors to categorize the items that pop up very swiftly as being elitist or being common. And this also pertains to pleasant and unpleasant. So the synonyms for pleasant and unpleasant, people are also very easily able to categorize this, and also the I and the we and so on. Now, and then the test round come. And what is then done, on the left-hand side, you have, you need to categorize common cultural expressions and synonyms for pleasant. So one of the two pops up, and those need to be categorized on the left. And the right-hand side, elitist cultural expressions need to be categorized, and unpleasant words. So now you simultaneously have to sort concepts and attributes. Concepts and attributes. And the basic idea is that you are much better, so swifter and with less flaws, able in case that specific combination is so-called congruent for you. So if somewhere deep in your brain, common cultural expressions are considered have an association with pleasant, then you are much better able to categorize those two simultaneously at the same site than in case that common is for you ingrained as unpleasant. Is that clear? That's the whole idea of the implicit association test. And so we embedded those two types of implicit association tests in a survey fielded March 2020 in the list panel. So it takes quite some time, and I it was 6 or 7 minutes, and we also had quite a battery of survey questions also for various other projects. So we decided to randomly assign one IET to each respondent. And it was positioned after the list of questions. And now I will show you the main findings. So what do we, what do we see here? The first is the unpleasant IET. So in the end, I will say something about that later on the concluding slides. It's in 700 respondents, and what you see here are the scores dissected for respondents with higher levels of education, medium levels of education, and low levels of education. And the scores around the 0 are in light gray bars, are made light gray because according to the IET literature, the idea is that if they are, the associations are weaker than minus 0.15 or between and 0.15, it's not meaningful. Not meaningful. So more to the left and more to the right, they become more meaningful. And what you then see is, so the scores on the left indicate the respondents that were much more swifter able to categorize pleasant words and common cultural expressions simultaneously, while those on the right-hand side were much better and swifter able to categorize pleasant words and elite cultural phenomena simultaneously. And what you then see is that, especially for the more educated individuals, the bulk of the population, the bulk of that subset of the population has, to a certain extent, an implicit, so beyond intentional control, they report much more affinity with elite culture. Medium educated somewhere in between, and for the less educated, you can see that still a large part also has some kind of ingrained cultural capital, but a much more substantial share of the less educated respondents than that of the more educated respondents. For them, the concurrent condition is common cultural expressions together with pleasant words. So this is somewhat more than 1 in 4. And among the more educated respondents, it's less than 1 in 20. Now, according to Bourdieusians, they would say, according to this course, you would say that somewhat more than 1 in 4 children from less educated parents, without being conscious, demonstrate the type of behaviors that are frowned upon in educational settings and in formal institutions. While this merely occurs to 1 in 20, or somewhat less than 1 in 20, of those born and raised in less educated milieux. The second set of finding is not on the IET of the unpleasant IET, but is on the self-concept IET. And here it is less outspoken. Yeah? Also because they are situated at the same part of the slide, you can see the difference. So going back to the previous slide, you can see that the distribution switched to the left. It's much more normally distributed around a 0 score, which the basic finding, I would say, is that although, according to the first IED, a substantial part of the population, especially more educated people, have an ingrained affinity with elite culture, but they do not so much, or a large part of them do not so much translate this somehow in also considering themselves and associating themselves with elite culture. So in Bourdieusian terms, this would be something like feeling less inclined to also state that you're part of elite culture lovers, let's say. Yeah, so these are the basic findings when it comes to the distribution dissected by level of education. Multivariate analysis show that both IEDs also positively associate with parental education, which is of course in line with the whole idea of Bourdieusian cultural reproduction. And in case of the unpleasant IED, it also positively associates with parental income. Which brings me to the last slide, if I remember it correctly. Yeah, so depending, of course, on your possibly staggering critique, it's the first valid instrument for measuring non-declarative cultural capital, we would say. There are quite some similarities with the most often used IEDs around the globe, the race IEDs and the gender IEDs. And there you see that the mean scores, roughly, especially the unpleasant IED, so the mean score of 0.41. So generally in the population is rather tilted towards an inculcation of elite culture, but also when it comes to, for instance, when it comes to gender, the inculcation of that masculinity is higher status, or that white is higher status than black. You see roughly the same type of findings. And I started this this presentation with the whole idea of cultural capital and cultural reproduction, because that's the bedrock of this type of research. But I would say a non-declarative cultural capital has potential also for all kinds of other gradients or stratified patterns, for instance, in political attitudes and behavior. Think about low affinity with formal political institutions, low affinity with establishment politicians, not feeling inclined to state your opinion, and so on. I think it's very likely to expect that it is associated quite strongly with non-declarative cultural capital, but also in health-related behaviors and health outcomes. Yeah? Simply feeling at ease with discussing something with your doctor and so on is for people with high levels of cultural capital much easier to do, because the person in front of you is roughly similar to your own parents, than from people from the lower strata who have inculcated this much less. Now, there are, of course, various limitations. So we developed this IED, but therefore, by definition, it is included in cross-sectional analysis. These theoretical claims have some kind of temporal causality, of course, that cannot be tackled here. Right? The IED have some caveats. I do not know whether some people are schooled in psychology, but there are various reservations made. One is that now let me rephrase. One common argument against the IED is what we do see on an individual level, that when we have IED scores, that does not associate that strong with explicit scores on the same concept. So if you would score, let's say, as racist inclinations by means of an IED, then the relationship with survey items in which you have some reservations regarding cultural diversity and so on are not that strong. But, and I think here, fortunately for sociologists, the more sociological application that we performed here is less sensitive to this, because as one psychologist in the United States, Spain, demonstrates, when you aggregate scores, for instance, by region, then you see quite substantial associations. And of course, we do not aggregate by region, but we do, of course, aggregate by socio-economic positions. So generally, on an individual level, scores might not be that strongly associated with more explicit measures, but group-wise, it seems that it does, also according to our findings. Yeah, different subsets for the two IATs. That's because of time limitations, and unfortunately, by now that puzzle must be solved. Most of you will have seen. Okay, you started with 2,400 respondents, and then 700 at one IAT and 720 at the other one. And unfortunately, at the end of the survey back then, 2020. They needed to download and install. I'm not very tech savvy, so I'm reproducing what my fellow authors say here. Plug in before the IAT, and there we lost quite some respondents. But by now, that's not necessary anymore. So if you want to include, if you would develop an IAT and include it in the survey, this will not lead to such a great loss in respondents. Yeah, that was what I wanted to share with you. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your comments.
Right, thanks, Jeroen. We have plenty of time for questions. Also, if you're online, then you need to be because I didn't bring my computer. Oh, guys, so we can see. So if you're online, you're more than happy to ask a question by typing it in the chat.
Q&A.
The Q&A box. Q&A box. Are there any questions? Maybe it's your name.
I'm Louisa, and I'm a PhD student in the sociology department. So actually, some sociologists. Yeah, so I found it really interesting. Yeah, it seems like a really cool way to think about cultural capital and also embodied or, non-declarative cultural capital. But so I was wondering, by how you pitched it in the beginning, I was thinking you would go more into like embodied kind of cultural capital. And I think for me, that would be super interesting to do. And I was just thinking a bit about, I was wondering as well whether you've been thinking about this, whether you could also use the implicit association test somehow to get more at this part, like whether you could present some pictures, for example, of body postures. So these kinds of things.
Yeah.
So that was a question I had. Then another question I had was, I know that not everybody is a fan of the whole omnivore literature. So the idea is that people like that it's not really the high status cultural signals that are good anymore, but they're declarative kinds of signals. And I was also a bit wondering, maybe you're not 10, but how you would relate to it, and whether it would make sense to also integrate these items more. And then I was also wondering whether you thought about including the old traditional measures of cultural capital, just to see how it relates to this, or whether you've actually done it. Because I think what I'm wondering now a bit is whether you would actually find differences, or whether it would actually just be the people who would also score highly on old measures that would also score highly now. So kind of this actually, yeah, it's a thing, but really interesting. Really cool.
Thank you very much, my dear fellow sociologists, for all your questions. Very fortunately, I can answer them also by what is included in the piece, of course, because we did think about these things. And indeed, so non-declarative and embodied are more or less synonyms, and non-declarative being the Lizardo term, actually. And we give some examples of what you might also do. Other elements or aspects of cultural capital can also be included in IATs. So also think about, if you think about ideas of Leroux on parenting styles, right? But also in the posture, ways of communicating. Yeah, there are many possibilities. Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to omnivoriousness, mostly I pronounced it not correctly first time, so I won't repeat it again, because now I succeeded. Hurrah! The thing is, but please bear with me. Omnivores are especially found among the higher strata, and those omnivores also consume common culture, but often do in some kind of camp, ironic way. So if you are, in the Dutch example, really heartfelt singing along with André Hazes, that's not what they do, but in an ironic way, they do, and then it can be done in also signaling some kind of. The question is, of course, does that lead to other scores in these IATs? That's an empirical question, which I cannot answer, but my claim would be that in case it does, this IAT would even underperform in showing the stratified nature of the preferences, right? And because then you would think that it is deflated. Yeah, that is deflated. But omnivorousness itself, especially because it's not so much by what you consume, but how you consume it, how you consume. That is something that we also elaborate in the piece. That's something that you can include in an IET, right? So if you show a Pabst can of beer, yeah, from working class culture, it's a standard kind of American beer, but in a more upper strata, especially young males, it has some other overtones by now in the US. But that's something that you can dissect by means of the IET. That's unfortunately some things you cannot do, other things you can. And we have indeed included also the standard survey items. And the standard survey items associated around somewhere between 0.25 and 0.20 with the IETs. And there's also what, for instance, the race IETs and explicit race measures, gender IETs and explicit gender measures also find this type of relationship, 0.25. But what we especially see, and I did not delve into this because of matters of length, is that as you did see, the IET scores are rather normally distributed. And that's a good thing. Not only methodologically, but also conceptually, I would say, because the standard survey, cultural capital survey items are very, very unevenly distributed. It's a very specific subset of the people that actually go to the opera and so on. And so we claim in the piece that the standard measure, which has been used from the 1980s onwards, so more than 4 decades now, is flawed in that part of the people with actually quite some cultural capital are measured as having no cultural capital because for whatever reason they do not go to the opera. So we claim that in addition to being able to measure the non-declarative part, it's also much better able to measure cultural capital in general.
Yeah. The question is, did you think about whether levels of literacy might influence the results? So I know that if it was part of the Bliss panel, then of course it has to have like some level, people have to have some level of literacy.
Yeah.
But especially since we're talking about like milliseconds and reactions, in order to even get a significant result from congruent versus incongruent, might that especially influence the longer words and the less educated group? Because I know that for exactly that reason, in race and gender IETs, pictures are often used, right?
Yeah.
So do you think that influenced anything?
Yeah, well, we were aware of this, and we took this into account because there were also the people, the 5 gentlemen listed in addition to it. It was quite some work. It was just one slide, but developing is quite. It was fun, but also quite some work. And indeed, what you aim to do is make it as simple as possible because many IETs indeed show photos, images, which are much easier to process, of course, also for the less literate. But here the Dutch words on the left-hand side, for instance, the cultuurprogramma, we talked a lot about it. Like it's lengthy, but what we did find is that, and especially Julian did that part of the data handling, is that step 1, the number of people not being able to swiftly and correctly categorize was more or less the same as, for instance, with standard race or gender IETs. So that's a good thing. Secondly, we also did hardly to none that see difference between the items. So it's not so much that certain items were less, that people make more often flaws with one item than another one, which could have at least 2 meanings, the one that you were referring to correctly, but also, of course, because it is less more ambiguous. But no, that worked rather well. Okay. Yeah, also especially for a word like cultuurprogramma. Yeah.
And that was also why you were referring to a pilot in which like an independent sample was scoring these words, right?
Yeah.
So was that on a like Likert scale? Was that
1 to 10?
Continuous. Okay.
Yeah.
That, at first I thought it was only you have to add two words, which one is more elitist, which one is more common, but it was really, they
Yeah.
were scored in.
Yeah, an item, and then score 1 or 0 elitist, score 10 common, and then please score it.
Okay.
And and the items that we use are very, very skewed distributions. Yeah, which of course what you aim for. Yeah.
Yeah, most of my questions were out. Well, I have one more. So it was based on the reaction time, right?
Yeah, that's reaction time. Yeah.
And the second one, the self-concept,
Also.
don't you think that it measures rather an identification than cultural capital itself?
Yeah, but it does measure. The aim was that it measures identification, but in somewhere deep in Bourdieu, you recently read him. I was just informed. Somewhere deep in Bourdieu, you can also distill the whole idea that if you are born and raised in an ample cultural capital milieu, you will also start to identify yourself as part of it. But yeah. Empirics show less so than infinity, right? So that's an interesting finding, I would say. And again, we think that part of the people that actually have quite high levels of cultural capital, be it declarative or non-declarative, do not feel entitled to also identify themselves as such. I think my answer would be that especially pertains to the limited number of people that actually go to the opera and so on and so forth.
I had a question about the slides with results with the graphs.
Yeah.
Yes, this one, and this one, for instance. So what exactly is on the x-axis? So what is this association? What exactly?
So so negative scores. So on the left-hand side, represent that for respondents, common culture and pleasant is congruent. So they are those respondents on the left are better and more swiftly able to simultaneously categorize common culture and pleasant. Then they are able to categorize common culture and unpleasant.
Okay, so it's sort of the reaction time is it's based on reaction time.
Yeah, and so and the two conditions are detracted from another. So yeah. Subtracted. Thank you. Yeah, detracted. General. Brilliant.
So that's why they also can be larger than -1 and 1.
Yeah.
And the grayed out bars and then the non-meaningful responses, they also seem to decline the level of education, right? So
Sorry?
for the low education, they are much. I cannot see that from here, but
No, that's a more limited respondent set. So the number of respondents is lower for the less educated than for the more educated. So the y-axis is the number of respondents.
okay. Yeah.
In thousands or?
No. So in total 700. So the bars represent each time a few respondents. But in the end, it also adds up to more than 450 or so. So.
And the main effect is that the distribution shifts to the left, or
the main effect is it for the whole population, all 700?
oh yeah. So I mean, you're comparing this between the levels of education, right? And so the effect you're basically describing is that the distribution shifts.
Yeah.
Left, the lower the education.
Yeah. The less educated people are, the more often for them common culture and pleasant is the congruent condition.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
I was interested in how these measures
for almost 2 decades now. Kiel back then, in 2019, it was still the idea to perhaps also include it in his PhD thesis, but because of all kinds of delays, because of Corona and so on, we did not. And the same applied to Tim. And perhaps he would also include one empirical chapter on how it relates to receptivity to health information and so on. But in the end, it also we did things differently because of time limitations of the Corona regime. But yes, we did find that various political attitudes and behavior quite substantially associate with non-declarative cultural capital. So stronger than income, stronger than level of education, to the best of my knowledge, on a par as the declarative cultural capital. So if you would ask people, for instance, so you have these ideas of misrecognition in politics, we just think about correlations to somewhere between 0.3 and 0.4. Yeah, quite substantial. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeroen. Fantastic stuff. I have 2 questions, and the first one is about the validity of your measure. So you're measuring cultural capital. But I was wondering, to what extent are you measuring that someone wants to be high or low on cultural capital, right? So it could be that I am a social climber. I'm in university right now, and I really want to associate classical music, the opera, everything with something positive.
Yeah.
So I also do it in my mind, but my parents were not highly educated. Could also be the other way around, right? That I'm very elitist, and that I'm now I have lots of friends who are not. So I also want to really associate myself with people who sing André Hazes all the time.
Yeah.
Right? So to what extent are you measuring the cultural capital itself, or is it something else really that you're measuring?
Yeah, well, the whole idea in Bourdieusian thought, as was often referred to as the habitus, at least in part, it is beyond intentional control. And that does far escape empirical scrutiny, and that's what we aim to develop a measure for. Now, if you refer to the example of a social climber, apart from individual cases, generally Bourdieusians would say that social climbers generally will have lower scores than those born and raised in the upper strata already. And then the question is, which is an empirical matter, to what extent later on in life do you start inculcating this elite culture? Because there's also an age effect, by the way. And you can say, on the one hand, that is because the items might be outdated, perhaps, so something that we say something about. But on the other hand, if you're 70 years old, and you were born and raised in the upper strata, then it's also logical to expect that it's much stronger inculcated than when you're really 10 or 15 years old. So it explicitly is the idea to not let this measure be tainted by ambitions, but by something that is, so if you have the ambition to be part of a certain milieu, but at the extent to which it is ingrained and beyond intentional control, report it.
Yeah, thanks.
But generally, I would say social climbers will, because of their social climbing, generally get somewhat higher scores. But the question then is, of course, and some of the room might have a background in psychology and know much better than I do. You hold these kind of ideas of formative years, right? When you are young, and then when you're somewhat older, it becomes that you're that you adapt less to a situation. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks. One more question, if I may. Sure. You have different results for the self concept, right? Yeah. And could it be that when it comes to the self concept, it's easier words that are also more alike compared to the because it's all I, right? Myself, etc., and versus other, and words that are really close to other, and really pretty short and simple.
There's a difference because the words are shorter. That's true. The attributes, by the way, we do not came up with these attributes ourselves. These are standard attributes to be used in IEDs. So we developed the concepts because we wanted to develop an IED for cultural capital, but the attributes are standard attributes. But if I think along with you, we might get other scores with the self-concept ayat than with the pleasant ayat, because the items are shorter, the words. Well, I know there's somewhere also in the piece that generally, which make our findings again somewhat more remarkable, that generally the self-concept ayat and the pleasant ayat get the same results. Generally, so and there are hundreds of millions of them. Yeah. And the only thing I can come up with, as I just mentioned, but which is some kind of conscious reasoning, right? That some do not associate themselves with elite culture, although they have quite strong implicit associations as a preference with elite culture, because they do not consider themselves entitled. But it's a very conscious line of argument, right? It's yeah.
Yuka, I'm also a sociology student. And I'm also working a bit on social capital and cultural capital, but then in primary school. So one thing I was thinking about, are you also planning to run, or do you think that this type of measure could be used among children?
Yeah.
Like, do you have any references for these implicit associations in primary school, secondary school? And the other thing I was thinking about was, did you look at the differences in these associations to your own level of education and parental education? That can, like, especially given this discussion about social climbers, for instance, because I can imagine that self-identification is stronger if you stay in the same social strata as you grew up in, especially because of this thing like, do you learn to like certain stuff in education, or are you grown up with it like from in your home environment?
Yeah, well,
Or,
the first question, there is a certain cutoff. I have small children myself, and I know my eldest is 5. She is certainly not able to do an IELTS because the time span in which they it's right. Oh my God! But somewhere for the age of 8, 9, it can be done. It's also another setup with big buttons, the best one knowledge. Yeah, as soon as children can do IELTS, you can also let them, of course, do some kind of cultural capital IELTS. That must be possible.
that more related to in-school behavior.
Yeah, for instance. Yeah.
Disney film purpose.
Yeah, Disney film.
Yeah, because they do not work French art cinema when they're 8, 9 years old. But communication styles, posture. There must be. But you had a second question.
Yeah, about parental education.
Well, they do also associate with parental association of education,
In
but
the same way.
somewhat less strong.
Yeah, and if you condition, for instance, the association of your own education by parental education, or if you like only look at people who stay in the same social strata as their parents.
Yeah, well,
I don't know if you have
the effect of parental education, we did not do a formal mediation analysis, but the effect of parental education declines or falls to insignificance when education of the respondent is included, which is also logical to expect, of course. And also the parental education, we thought it's better to be roughly right than to be precisely wrong. Yeah, that's the term. To let as many respondents report on their parental education, we did a less fine-grained measure, because many people do not actually know what their parents specifically did, because the schooling system also swings. So that's in very general terms, but still.
Yeah, I have
questions.
Okay. So I'm from Hungary, and there was quite.
Thank you.
So there was a quite big, let's say, elite change and like cultural. So, what do you think that where there are more ethnocentric or more, let's say, populist, rurality focused elites? What does it measure? Yeah.
The interesting thing, I would say, also because former communist countries because upper class culture was rooted out, of course, for quite some time, quite violently as well. So I would generally expect that elites behind the Iron Curtain will have lower scores. But I'm not a specialist in that regard. When it comes to ethnocentrism, among the people at large, it's quite tilted towards race eye. It's quite tilted towards an affinity with white faces and a low disaffinity with black faces. Also among black people, by the way. So it's quite again a tongue breaker for me. Do you want us? Yeah, but I do not know, although I have an idea, what the educational gradient is on race IELTS scores. Although I would think that it also has an educational gradient.
Yeah, I'll make it short, but I was surprised by the difference in the effects of the pleasant versus unpleasant and the I versus other IAT, because intuitively I would have expected the results to be the other way around, right? That highly educated people say, oh, these elitist cultural words, yes, I own them, although I don't necessarily enjoy them. For example, the opera, I think you have a sense of entitlement there, even though you might not enjoy it.
Yeah.
Were you surprised by this? Did you have any hypotheses against this? And how would you reintegrate that into the general theoretical and behavioral context then? How does it relate to what we see on a behavioral level?
Yeah.
1 minute.
But I think the whole idea of entitlement is crucial. But then the other way around, if you now suggest that people that also have quite high levels of cultural capital and various ways measured do not consider themselves entitled to also consider themselves part of the elite, right? I think the elite is elite as in small. Yeah, that's the only thing that I can say about this. But we did not expect it in advance as well, because somewhere in the front end of the piece, we also based on earlier findings of other IELTS, which roughly boil down to the finding. They roughly boil down to the same findings. It's the two types of IELTS, and in our case, that's not the case.
So you're kind of thinking your status is at some point so high that you don't even have to associate it with yourself anymore. You have the luxury of not even having to.
That's not. Yeah, then it would be over entitlement, some kind of blasé attitude instead of low levels of entitlement. No, my hunch would be many people associate either this culture when it comes to the people they associate with a very limited set of people. And not so much a very large part of the population that has some kind of affinity with elite culture in general.
Okay. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Okay, it's 2 minutes before 4, so I give the word to Gijs for that.
Thanks a lot, Jeroen. Great questions, everyone. I didn't have the chance to ask my own questions. It's too bad. But I want to invite you all for a follow-up experiment that we just came up with. If you want to participate, we'll blindfold you, and we'll give you 5 different beers, peaceful pills to extremely hoppy infused IPA, and then you very quickly need to order this as good or bad. We're calling this the beer IAT, and we're hoping it would be sort of an alternative measure to what you just proposed, but then a more fun measure.
I don't know whether it's more valid, but it's absolutely more fun.
Yes. Let's see. We'll be doing that downstairs in the cafe. So please join us. And then I want to, of course, thank Jeroen for coming all the way to 020. And that's a cultural reference. I'm familiar with it. And of course, you'll get our little trophy, black coffee mug. I've heard that
many times.
You can also put in whiskey and nobody notices.
Nobody knows.
That they just as good as And I just wanted to ask one thing that wasn't clear to me. Is this actually already published? Or?
No, it's on the review, already on the review. So I'm the first author of this piece. And we had 6 or 7 PhDs in previous years and 2 or 3 postdocs, and their proceedings were more important than my own. So therefore, yeah, this familiar. Yeah. But now I had some time in the recent 6 months.
So I'm hoping that things we've said today will help you in the review.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, so what's up for the next few weeks? We have 2 more meetings before the summer. Next week we have Tony van der Meer talking about something in communication science.
Something, yeah.
What is his general topic of research?
Crisis communication and polarization.
Crisis communication, polarization.
So things that are causes and content, content,
Consequences, antecedents,
a combination, and overview of my work.
interaction. Will be lots of fun. And then the week after we have Graphic Friday with Dani Kamarami presenting, and I guess one more person. Maybe I think we talked about this one.
If I have an entire.
Otherwise,
I'm happy.
otherwise we give you the whole hour. You deserve it. And I guess we will be talking about narcissism and populism
And status threat.
and state threats. Exciting stuff. And I want to thank our sponsors, of course, the ERC, NWO, and Apple's Association for Politics and Life Sciences. Do fun, I guess. Sure. Who did I forget? Besides, I guess it's enough for today.
We're always open for sponsors.
We're always looking for more. Yes. Thanks a lot for joining us, and see you in the bar.